Well, good morning. Welcome to this webinar organized by Britcham, the British Chamber of Commerce and Industry in Brazil. I am Ana Paula Vitelli, President at the Chamber, and I would like to take this first few minutes to introduce the Chamber to those who are here watching us. Our Chamber's mission is to be the focal point for the UK-Brazil business community, providing relevant forums to foster bilateral trade, investments, services, and networking opportunities. We have a national presence in Brazil, being in São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Minas Gerais, and Paraná. The Chamber operates with a series of industry committees covering key industries in the country, as well as areas of expertise across industries. For further information about our committees and events, please check our website at www.britcham.com.br. Now it is time to thank those who have been involved in this initiative. So firstly, to the Chamber supporting members, which had their names and brands shown in our screens just before we started this session. Then I'd like to thank Contra Risks, one of our Chamber members, here represented by Geert Aalbers, Charles Hecker, and Thomaz Favaro. Thank you for accepting our invitation to share this very relevant content with us. Before we start with the webinar, let me explain the dynamics of our session this morning. So today's webinar is being streamed live via Zoom and also Britcham's YouTube channel. And this session is being recorded and will be made available after the webinar on YouTube. As usual, we will have our speakers covering their content, followed by a Q&A session. The Q&A session will be referred to Britcham members, and questions can only be sent using the Q&A tool on Zoom. Please note that we will not be taking questions via YouTube, as the chat there is not being moderated during the webinar. As a Britcham member, if you wish to ask a question, please mention your name and company for identification purposes. Questions will be moderated, and we apologize in case we are not able to take them all due to time constraints. Let me then introduce our audience to our speakers this morning. So first, Geert Aalbers is a partner at Contra Risks and heads the Brazilian Southern Cone business. He manages complex investigations into fraud, corruption, and other ethics breaches. Geert has over 20 years of experience working in Latin America. He has developed an in-depth network of contacts and understanding of regional business practices and the risk environment. Geert is also a member of Contra Risks Global Executive Committee. Charles Hecker is responsible for shaping Contra Risks thought leadership on geopolitics, global security, political risk, and their impact on international businesses. Charles speaks at industry, policy, and academic conferences and represents the company's work to the international media. He oversees Contra Risks' global political risk output and has led responsibility for the company's annual flagship publication called RiskMap. Then Thomaz Favaro, last but not least, Thomaz Favaro is responsible for the strategic direction and growth of Contra Risks' political risk consulting business in Brazil and the Southern Cone, with management responsibility for the analyst team in São Paulo. He supports clients to successfully manage risk control across their global operations through a range of consulting solutions, including market entry studies, political and regulatory analysis, among others. He was also previously an analyst and consultancy on the Latin America analyst team based in Bogota and London. Welcome to you, Geert, Charles, and Thomaz. And then I'll pass this to you. I'll pass the floor to you, actually, first, Geert, for your talk, and then I'll come back later after the presentation to moderate the questions. So thank you very much. Wish you all a great event.
Thank you very much, Ana Paula, and thank you, Britcham. We have made a bit of a ritual every year to partner with Britcham to present RiskMap. And we have about 55 minutes to try and make sense of the world and answer all your questions as well. So I will keep the introduction short because I'd like to hand off to Chuck and Thomaz. But first of all, I do encourage you, those of you who have linked via Zoom, to submit questions. If we're not able to answer them, because we have a team of around 50 analysts or so globally, 50, 60 analysts, there may be some very specific themes you're interested in. We promise to get back to you with responses, but most of the questions I think we'll be able to field here in some shape or form. Just to contextualize RiskMap, Chuck will introduce RiskMap, but Control Risk as a global risk consultancy has been, at least for 25 years, we've put out some form of RiskMap, which is a forward-looking projection of what we see in the year ahead. And I know for many of you, this feels like month 14 or so of 2020, but we are looking at 2021 as a new year, and there are some distinct risks which we'd like to discuss with you, which are particular for this year and will have an impact on your businesses or your clients' businesses. For those who are not familiar with Control Risk, we are a global independent risk consultancy, and we help clients build resilient businesses. So we help them implement compliance programs, we help them conduct risk assessments, we help clients respond to crises or when risks materialize. So whether that's crisis management generally, or investigations or litigation disputes. And we also help clients capitalize on opportunities, so with country risk entry, pre-M&A, due diligence, and the like, and all of what we're going to be discussing today. So the type of research which Chuck oversees globally informs our advice to our clients, and that's how it all comes together. So on that note, I just want to thank everyone for tuning in today, and looking forward to an engaging discussion. And over to you, Chuck.
Geert, thank you very, very much. And a very big thank you, of course, to Ana Paula for hosting us, for those very generous introductions, and to the Britcham, of course, for providing this fantastic platform for all of us to speak today. I think this is my 4th time presenting with the Britcham, and so it's nice to come back, even though I can't be with everyone in Sao Paulo. Just for a feeling, it was -6 degrees overnight in London last night. And so I really wish that I could be in that warm Sao Paulo atmosphere right now, but perhaps next year we'll all be together in person again. So what I want to say is, for anybody who was with us in those previous sessions, welcome back to RiskMap for Britcham. And for those of you who are here for the very first time, welcome. It's wonderful to have all of you dial in and join us today. RiskMap, of course, is our annual flagship forecast of political and security risk for the coming year. We've been doing RiskMap for almost 25 years, I think probably more than 25 years, and it's the product of more than 100 of our political risk analysts and other colleagues from around the world. But for the past several years, we have been publishing a list of top 5 risks with every RiskMap. And this is our view of the most important trends, the most important issues for the coming year that we, and we want all of our clients to focus on and to plan for and to adapt to in the coming year. And we're going to go through those in just a moment. But Thomaz, if you can click us through to the next slide and a picture of the map itself. This is the RiskMap. And I'll just ask you one thing, and that is to remember that this is not a snapshot of the world today. This is our forecast of the year to come. And what you see in front of you among them is the colors. The colors are our forecast for security risk, where dark green means very low security risk, and dark red means extreme security risk. And the letters that I hope you can see on your screens represent a forecast for political risk, and that's on the same scale represented by letters, from VL for very low to E for extreme. And, you know, a lot of people use this map in a lot of different ways. Some people look at their favorite country or they plan their holidays on this map, you know, when we can do that once again. But I think the most important function of RiskMap is for companies to map their global footprint and to make sure that everyone has the right amount of energy and the right amount of capacity in the right countries, so that your efforts coincide with the places where you need to be for the coming year. So let's move on now and have a look at our number one risk for 2021. We'll try to go fairly quickly so I can turn over to Thomaz for his views on Latin America as soon as possible. But in our number one risk is what we call a world with long COVID. And this really is a referral to or a reference to the way the virus behaves in the human body. We know that COVID can last for a really long time inside the human body. And we feel that for 2021, the virus is going to last for a very long time in the global body. There is absolutely no escaping, really, that for 2021, the number one driver of risk around the world is going to be the pandemic. But it's going to be a little bit different than it was last year. Because last year, we were tracking infection rates. This year, we're going to be tracking vaccination rates. And the way it looks so far is quite interesting. So, outside the European Union, there are only 7 other countries that have ordered enough vaccine to cover their entire population. After that, there's a group of about 92 countries that will be depending on the COVAX facility for access to vaccine. But COVAX has already said that in the best of all circumstances this year, they will be able to cover about 20% of the population of countries that are participating in the COVAX facility. And then after that, we feel that there will be a group of countries this year that will have no vaccine at all. And the result of this picture is the development of have and have not countries and a multi-speed and fragmented exit from the pandemic. Countries with enough vaccine will be able to lift their restrictions and then begin to return to economic activity faster, earlier, and better than any other country. And then after that, you'll have countries that are sort of stuck a little bit. They're slowly returning to economic activity. And then there will be countries that will have no economic activity or that will be stuck in the pandemic permanently for 2021. And the risk to companies, the challenge to companies this year is that all of us will have a footprint in each of these types of countries, in the fast countries, the medium countries, and the no or slow countries. This is an enormous challenge as far as planning the exit from the pandemic, and will test our resilience, our agility, are able to plan and to communicate, not just internally, but also with our markets, with our suppliers, and with our customers, and to identify where the pinch points will be in 2021 and the impact that they will have on our business. And so, you know, as much as we felt that challenge on the way in to the pandemic, we think there's a significant risk that we'll feel the same challenge on the way out of the pandemic. Thomaz, let's move along to number 2, which is perhaps a slightly more traditional driver of political risk for the coming year, you know, something that we're used to talking about in addition to the pandemic, and that's the rivalry between the United States and China. And, you know, I guess this is a good time to remember that whether you're in Brazil or elsewhere in Latin America, or you're based or do business in the US, or you have activities in China, this is the time to remember that the rivalry between the United States and China is not going away. This is not just a trade war. This is not just maritime tensions in the South China Sea. This is a strategic rivalry for technological supremacy globally. And those sorts of rivalries just don't go away. They stay for a really long time. And what they do is they make headaches for all of us. They make headaches for companies that want to do business with the US, or for companies that want to do business with China, or, you know, for that magical combination of companies that actually want to do business with both. It's also probably important to remember that Washington, D.C. right now, Tomas, if we can move ahead one, Washington, D.C. right now is uniformly anti-China. And so here's the interesting thing about that. We feel that the transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration probably won't change US policy towards China all that much, because it's very, very difficult to find any American politician right now who is pro-China. Republican, Democrat, State Department, White House, it's all continually aligned against China. And so even though President Biden and President Trump are completely different types of politicians, you won't really feel that in the policy. What you will feel are a few important things. And that is that some of the emotion, some of the anger, and some of the, you know, having to check Twitter every morning, you know, that will go away. And one of the best things about the transition from Trump to Biden is that we will all be able to once again plan our relationship with China, because US foreign policy will once again become the product of a more normal, institutional, multilateral approach. We'll have a State Department that is fully functional. We'll have a team of ambassadors that is up to 100% strength. And we'll be able to understand in advance what the United States feels about China and what that means for our companies. And we think that, I would say, in the next 6 to 12 months, you know, the initial phases of the Biden administration, China and the United States will sort of be feeling each other out a little bit. Don't forget that President Biden knows China extremely well. And China knows President Biden extremely well. So there'll be that feeling around for where can we cooperate, what are the sticking points, where are the red lines. In that moment, in the time that these two countries are getting reacquainted, companies need to plan their strategic approach towards doing business in the US and China. So bear the following things in mind. Biden will sustain tariff pressure. He will continue to control technology exports. He will add human rights to the relationship between the United States and China, and will also continue the policy of Buy American. The Chinese, we think, are prepared for a long-term struggle, and they will try to contain the United States where they can. They will push back on the US where they have to, but not militarily. But our view on the likelihood of any kind of military conflict between the US and China is very low, you know, dark green on that topic. But what China is trying to do instead is foster a policy of self-reliance to gradually reduce and ultimately remove its dependence on the US in spheres of technology and lots of other areas. At the same time, Xi Jinping is going to try to show the rest of the world that China is open for business. So it's a complicated agenda in Beijing of self-sufficiency, but international cooperation. And we'll sort of see how that works over the next few years. Bear in mind that China always has a longer term perspective on international relations than the United States. Tomas, let's move forward and talk a little bit about the environment. When we were all together in Sao Paulo last year, we didn't talk about the environment in the top 5. And a lot of people thought that we really missed something very important. So it's back. And this year we talk about the risk involved in missing this absolutely critical moment of focus on climate change. And think about this. On the one hand, we have organizations like Extinction Rebellion, which is one of the world's most extremist activist organizations. And on the other hand, we have the private equity business, And in 2021, these two groups have almost the same agenda, and that is improving the environment and limiting climate change. And it's not very often that you see private equity investors and radical climate activists sort of coming together with similar agendas. But countries and companies this year are tripping all over themselves. They're tripping over each other to make carbon neutral declarations and green investment strategies. And don't forget now that also President Biden has rejoined the Paris Climate Accords, which means that the White House will once again be using both soft power and economic power to push compliance with the principles of the climate accords. The way that this is going to work for companies in 2021, and the moment of risk here is this: we expect there to be significant linkage between a company's financial health and its action in the environment. So think about this. The asset management business is looking through its portfolios and thinking, which of our companies have plans for climate change, plans to minimize their impact on climate change, but also plans to prevent climate change from damaging their business and therefore damaging their valuation and damaging their place in an asset manager's portfolio. Think about financial markets and the listing agencies that run the stock exchanges around the world. They also are seeking greater disclosure from the companies that they list on what they do to the environment and also what the environment does to them. Look out now for the emergence of a concept called environmental due diligence to move into, we have financial due diligence and integrity due diligence and legal due diligence. Now we have environmental due diligence as part of the B2B relationship. These are all absolutely critical and driving forward at accelerated pace for 2021. Thomaz, let's move on and talk a little bit about cyber. This is always in the top 5 for control risks, and we talked about this last year as well, but it's a little bit different now, taking into consideration the pandemic. And the origins of this risk for 2021 actually go back to 2020, when most of our clients and most of everyone's businesses around the world took their 5-year technology implementation strategy and they implemented that in 5 weeks. For a number of reasons, the pandemic accelerated everybody's mission to become a more online business. And this was partly things like working from home, which was a bit of an emergency situation, but it was also the more gradual evolution from bricks and mortar to online. And the pandemic put that on hyperspeed. And here's the risk. In some of our articles about RiskMap on our website this year, you'll see a survey that I think was done by the World Bank or the World Trade Organization. They surveyed a global set of chief technology officers at companies all around the world. And 76% of those chief technology officers said that they made mistakes in the rush to implement technology in 2020. What those mistakes have done, whether it's hardware implementation or software implementation, new applications, new policies, procedures, those mistakes are openings for cyber threat actors to take advantage of our businesses. And the problem going forward for 2021 and beyond is that the pace of technology implementation is no longer going to slow down. Companies that rush their implementation are going to provide opportunity for hackers, for cyber activists, cyber criminals, cyber espionage, and we have seen across the board massive spikes in ransomware, phishing, infiltration, and a series of different categories of cyber risk. And so what we're urging companies here is that as you implement hardware and software and policies and procedures in 2021, keep thinking about what's going to happen to your cyber landscape in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, and 5 years from now to protect the changes that you're making now. Finally, Thomaz, number 5. This is also one of these risks where I think we're going to ask you to think about today, but also to think about the future. And this involves the economic recovery and hopefully the beginning of the end of the pandemic. So we have a joint venture with a company called Oxford Economics, and they do all of the great macroeconomic forecasting around the world. And Oxford Economics, plus pretty much every forecaster around the world, they are all predicting a significant economic rebound in the second half of this year. Now, there are certain risks to that forecast, and that includes the vaccine. And if the vaccine rollout goes much more slowly than now, the economic recovery will be delayed. We also have the risk presented by variants to the coronavirus, and the risk that they will also slow down the return to economic activity. But everyone agrees that sooner or later, we're going to get busy again. And here's the risk for companies. There are a lot of companies around the world, and this may sound surprising, but it's actually true. There are a lot of companies around the world who are still in crisis management mode. And those companies will miss the economic opportunity coming in the second half of this year. At the very beginning of the pandemic, Thomaz, Geert, myself, colleagues inside Control Risks, we became members of our clients' crisis management teams and crisis management committees. And we learned an awful lot about how companies work in crisis in situations like that, how they communicate, how they prioritize, how they function as teams. And we saw that the companies that were able to spend some of their energy thinking about the future were the companies that did the best they could in 2020. And that this sounds simplistic, like, oh, don't forget to think about the future. But the pandemic brought about, for I think all of us, an absolutely career-changing or career-defining moment. Because even for companies that saw this coming, and there were lots of companies like that, even for companies that saw this coming, nobody anticipated the depth or the length of this pandemic. So the lessons that we learned at the beginning of the crisis are the lessons we need to remember now. And so our request to you is that if you are still dealing with tactical crisis management issues now at the beginning of 2021, make sure that some of your crisis management team's capacity, some of your human capital across the company bears in mind that there is strategic opportunity arising very soon. And make sure that those people have the support that they need to act on those opportunities. That's the end of my talk. Very much looking forward to questions at the end of the session. But before then, I'm going to turn over to Thomaz. Thank you very, very much for your attention.
Thank you, Chuck. Very interesting review of the top 5, and I'm sure the audience is thinking many ways in which that can be applicable and relevant, I guess, to the Brazil context as well. So I'm going to be addressing a different set of trends. They certainly overlap with the top 5, but the idea is to give you a perspective about what we see as sort of the major overarching trends that will be prevalent across Latin America in 2020-21, and obviously making specific reference to the impact in Brazil. The first, I think we are all very familiar with the impact of COVID on the economies in Latin America. I do want to stress that the region has been disproportionately more affected by COVID than other regions. And I can give you a very good example of that. Latin America is home to roughly 8% of the world's population, but it's also home to 30% of the COVID-related deaths. I guess that gives you an understanding of the scale of the impact of COVID on the region, and obviously not only in sanitary and health terms, but also in economic terms. Going forward, we do see many countries across the region struggling with vaccine rollout, either because of delays in securing vaccines, either because in difficulties in securing a volume large enough to vaccinate their entire populations, as well as situations arising from supply chain, struggling to get the sufficient ingredients from different parts of the globe to be assembled and manufactured locally. I guess Brazil is probably a very interesting example of that trend. But there's another component that of the pandemic that I think will be very critical to watch in 2020-21, which is the fiscal component. Latin America, or most Latin American countries, were already in a pretty weak fiscal position prior to the pandemic. And in 2020, these countries have really spent heavily on trying to alleviate some of the most negative socioeconomic effects of the pandemic. Brazil, for example, spent roughly 12% of GDP on an stimulus program. That is roughly double that of the average for emerging economies. And also other countries in the region have also spent heavily. That's the case of Chile, that's certainly the case of Peru. Mexico probably stands out as the anomaly there, or the exception insofar as the government hasn't really spent that heavily in 2020. But for the majority of countries which did, 2020-21 comes with a dilemma. On one hand, there is a need to go back to austerity and try to rebalance public finances sooner rather than later. Many countries have a very difficult situation concerning debt to GDP ratio and the trajectory of that debt to GDP ratio. And there is a greater pressure for these countries again to rebalance public finances. But on the other hand, you still have the pandemic ravaging, across the region. Many countries today still grappling with the worst time ever, since the beginning of the pandemic in March 2020, and populations that still require some degree of support because of rising unemployment, because of rising poverty, and because of, again, that excess demand on the public health sector. So it'll be a very difficult dilemma for governments across the region to navigate. And I guess a critical one to watch would be obviously Brazil, just because of the magnitude, and perhaps also because of the fact that we're all, or most of us are here. It seems that the government, for example, is willing to resume that emergency spending disbursement that was taking place, and I think it would be very important to watch the size of that, the scoping of that. Will this be really focused on the more vulnerable, or will be this a more generous package? Is there fiscal room for a more generous package? I guess all of these questions will be posed in the upcoming months, and will be key to determine again the recovery of these countries, and certainly that of Brazil. The second trend that we wanted to highlight is the fact that there is a general sense of malaise across the region. Economic growth has been lackluster for a number of years, and now we had a pretty deep recession across most economies. Where commodity prices are picking up, are still far from being at the super cycle level. There is a general sense of malaise with how governments responded to the pandemic by and large. There was, in the beginning of the pandemic, across most countries, not all of them, but across most countries, a rally around the flag effect, where the population was really clinging to the leadership to find responses to this challenge. This is a very typical phenomenon in times of crises, and one that I think was an interesting global phenomenon we saw across the world. But soon, after a few months, we already saw, approval ratings dipping, and now we have presidents across the region which are a relatively weak position. And most interestingly, we're also in a historical time where most of them are facing minority statuses in Congress. So they have small ruling coalitions which generally don't tend to reach the majority threshold for approving reforms. So we see a very difficult environment for reforms to progress. And again, I guess Brazil is a very interesting example of that. On one hand, you did see the government, I guess, securing some advancements in its relationship with Congress by the election of speakers for both houses. But on the other hand, we still see very significant number of challenges associated with how will the executive prioritize the agenda, the economic agenda versus other agendas. We saw, for example, that the government sent a list of 35 priority bills to Congress. Many of them are completely unrelated to the economy, issues around gun control, restrictions on abortion and other issues that may, again, take time and an effort from lawmakers from debating perhaps more pressing economic concerns, or even more pressing economic policies. So it'd be interesting to watch how the reform agenda will develop in Brazil and elsewhere. But I think overall we do see a very challenging environment for these reforms to progress. In prior years, or maybe prior decades, ideology was a very strong component holding back some of those reforms. We don't quite see that trend as evident today. I guess many, if not the majority, of the presidents across South America certainly were elected on business-friendly platforms and on business-friendly reforms. But I guess, again, it's more of a challenging environment for those reforms to flourish than being in the agenda in the first place. A third trend that we wanted to highlight, I guess, is the issue around anti-corruption enforcement. We obviously saw and experienced firsthand, significant momentum of anti-corruption enforcement across Latin America over the past decade. But we're seeing increasing signs of that enforcement wave losing momentum. That has been very adequately captured in our Capacity to Combat Corruption Index, which is a joint publication between Control Risks and the American Society Council of the Americas. And those who are familiar with that tool, stand by, because there's an update coming in around May, June. But maybe we can talk more broadly about how the pandemic is likely to impact this trend, right? I guess there are a few components that make the impact particularly worrisome. First is the fact that the pandemic is driving attention away from corruption, as people tend to focus on other issues, obviously, sanitary and health priorities, but also unemployment and the state of the economy, really, again, taking the priority seat that in prior years was taken by corruption. Obviously, there is also a situation where a good part of public spending is now under less stricter controls or less strict controls. You have a momentum where emergency procurement is many ways the best response that the governments can have to addressing this sanitary crisis, but that we also know that these emergency expenditures often come with less controls, less scrutiny, and create a more fertile ground for corruption. And last but not least, I think we saw also in a few countries this anti-corruption agenda being hijacked by populist leaders who now, in their campaign trails, but now once in office, these leaders, again, left and right, but with a very populist tone, are not unexpectedly not delivering on strengthening anti-corruption controls. So I guess this is something that I think we'll probably aim to capture a bit more vividly in the Capacity to Combat Corruption Index that will be coming in the next coming out in the next few months. And last but not least, just wanted to touch on a final trend. I do want to give us ample time for Q&A. I'm sure there are many pressing questions about the different trends that we addressed here. The fourth trend is regarding the situation around the trade in North America, and more specifically, the new NAFTA, USMCA, and how that will play out insofar as in the interest of Mexico and to a lesser extent Central American economies. We do see obviously a potential for a more predictable bilateral agenda between the US and Mexico, and certainly less room for contentious or conflicting views on key issues such as migration. We do, however, want to point out two areas where we see potential for greater conflicts or disputes between, again, Mexico and the new administration in the US. One of them concerns labor. So it was part of Biden's strategy to, again, reconnect with part of that blue-collar working class constituency. That part of that, went to Trump, and there was a really concerted effort across, the Democratic Party to try to lure the support back from the unions and bar from that. So I guess there is a renewed impetus for reviewing and assessing Mexico's compliance to labor standards and the wage agreements that are in place under the USMCA umbrella. And we know there are many sectors in Mexico that are still struggling to adapt, I guess, to some of these, the standards set in those agreements. And the other area where we see potential for friction is around energy. There is very clearly from the US a drive towards, climate change policies, and that comes obviously together with cleaner energy policies, and this is an area where we see again potential friction with the position in Mexico, which is in many ways doubling down on oil and gas and other non-renewable resources. And the other component in the equation is also within the energy market more broadly, including but not exclusively the oil and gas sector. The degree to which the Mexican government will be keen on or eager to open up the market for greater competitiveness. We know that this administration in Mexico has been particularly keen on favoring state-owned companies and a more state-centric approach, particularly to the energy sector, and that may clash again with the ambitions of the US and Canadian administrations towards a more competitive market across the borders, including in the energy sector. So with that, I do want to wrap up the trends that we have highlighted for Latin America specifically. I guess maybe we can open up the floor for questions from the audience. Maybe if we could ask Ana Paula to take the lead there in moderating some of those discussions with the audience.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much, Thomaz. Of course, thank you, Charles. Very interesting, you both, for the global risks that you presented and your comments, Thomaz, specifically in Latin America. So we do have questions. So I'm going to start bringing these forward, and then what we could do here, I'll just have it. There's no question specifically directed to specifically one of you. So I'll just make the question, and then you feel free, whoever wants to comment, and we'll make that work in that way. Okay. So the first question comes from Carlos Peixoto, who is the head of the Oil and Gas Committee at Britcham. So we get plenty of compliments here in terms of everyone. Thank you for the high-level presentation and very interesting content. And then Carlo brings that question is, how do you see the speed of companies' reactions to the public increased awareness of climate change consequences, especially in Brazil? So it's a question on environmental impact.
Thomaz, would you like to talk about what you're seeing in Brazil, and then I can talk a little bit about what we're seeing with clients in other places?
Sure.
Good, sounds good.
Yeah, so I think Brazil is obviously a vast economy, and it's amazing to see the different levels of maturity insofar, the sustainability talk and walk varies, across different countries, different companies in Brazil. Brazil obviously has sort of a leadership, at least among emerging markets, or at least part of its economy really focused on the green economy, on trading green bonds, and I guess in many ways, again, pioneering on that sense. But we also see many companies still struggling, I guess, to adapt to this new momentum and really bringing that as part of a comprehensive set of policies that trickle down across very interesting operations. I guess what is really driving, there are different drivers towards this. Obviously, we see the government enforcement of environmental legislation probably was more stricter in prior years than it is today, and I guess this is concerning so far as maybe may send conflicting messages to companies. But we see that the government is only one stakeholder out of many in this dialogue, right? Ultimately, you have consumers that are demanding this from companies and making sure that they're not only themselves but they're across their supply chain, they're not contributing to the deforestation or any other damaging effect to the environment that can contribute to from investors. You get greater concern from lenders. Obviously, you have regulators maybe in some in other markets, particularly European companies operating in Brazil. They are certainly under greater scrutiny in their home markets, again, for what they're doing in Brazil and what their subsidiaries are doing in Brazil. So I guess it's important to see that as being, and this is one of the reasons why we put that as a top 5, because this is a global trend, and where we see governments maybe tittering or maybe falling behind, there is still plenty of room for other actors to set the pace where maybe government actions are missing, and that's definitely a trend that we see very prevalent in Brazil as well.
Carlos, thanks for your question. I'll just add one quick thing to what Thomaz said, because your question was particularly about the speed of companies' reactions, which means that they're already reacting, but what are they doing now? And the answer is that they are working a lot faster towards this, because this is a trend that existed before the pandemic. The pandemic has accelerated this trend, like it's done with a lot of other trends around the world. And the interest in changing business models, changing investment activities, changing emphasis towards solar or wind or batteries or other sort of different types of energy has absolutely accelerated. And we'll see how the market reacts to this and what happens to these companies' valuations as they seek to modify their business model. There's just the one minor exception to this is that there are some companies in the hydrocarbon sector, whether they are drilling and exploration or their oil services, that have said, look, this is all we do. This is our business, hydrocarbons. And this is all we're going to do. And we're not going to change that much because we want to be the one that stays with this. And so while most companies are reformatting their business models faster and faster, there are a few companies that are just doubling down, if you will, and staying right with what they do.
And just to complement there, maybe from a slightly different perspective, as a global consultancy, we get asked these questions all the time about ESG, and one of the recurring questions is actually, and I see in some of the others, some kind of underlying, maybe some of the questions that have already been posed here is this a trend? Is this something that is a priority for Brazilian companies already, or is it just a lot of talk? Because we do hear much about that. And it's a hard question to answer, but I think what we've concluded and what we're seeing is even internally, in terms of levels of maturity concerned, we see Europe leading, and European clients in particular, and Europe-based organizations. We're starting to see greater levels of sensibility in the United States. I think the Biden administration obviously will place great emphasis on that area, but US is clearly lagging Europe in this respect. But from an international investor perspective, we do perceive that whether it's Brazil or other countries in Latin America, there is a systematic underestimation of the importance, I think, that international investors, whether they be direct investors, private equity funds, as Chuck mentioned, or lenders, or other stakeholders like clients and suppliers and the like, there's a systematic underappreciation of how important this has become for their agenda. And there are only a few certainties we have in this world, which is very volatile. But I would say one of them is that data and the use of technology is growing, and that will only go one direction. And we're pretty sure that the ESG agenda is another one of those. It's only going to grow in importance. So we're encouraging our clients to look at this, and it's a very challenging risk to manage, because from a corporate governance point of view, and we see that internally as well, where does it sit? Does it sit within the environmental area? Does it sit within sustainability? Does it sit within the compliance area? Does it sit within the risk management area? Is it across the business? It's one of those amorphous groups of interests which the company needs to manage, a grouping of risks, because they're very, very diverse. If you talk about E or S or G, they're very, very diverse risks. But they do need to be managed holistically somewhere or the other. And that's another challenge that companies face. Not only is this real, is this something which is a long-term trend, but how do we as organizations manage this type of, or these types of risks?
Okay, thank you, thank you. Our next question comes from James Morbell from Morbell Business Planning. And his question is, we in Brazil face all 5 of the global risks and at least the first 3 of the Latin America risks. How can the private sector and our companies help with this agenda in a country in which the government does not share this agenda in full?
I think that's a very interesting one. I think the agenda on vaccines, to be honest, I think the jury is still out there. We're still on a I guess we have a sense of the testing ground insofar as what role private companies can or should play in the rollout of the vaccines, and ambiguous signs, I guess, on both directions. So to be honest, I think it's a bit too early to say how that will play out. On the other hand, I do want to maybe just emphasize something that it's not perhaps widely acknowledged. Perhaps it's widely acknowledged in Brazil, but less so elsewhere, which is just the capacity of Brazil to roll out a mass vaccination program efficiently. There is quite a lot of know-how and knowledge. So once we're past some of these initial hurdles around securing supply and establishing a good system for production of those vaccines domestically, I think there's quite a good potential for Brazil to advance, I think, fairly steadily on that front. It's going to be difficult. It's definitely going to be not unidirectional, and we still see a situation in such a vast country. We have different state governments and the federal government. In addition to that, not necessarily disputing, but having to cope with a multitude of or multiple vaccines. But that's part of the game. I mean, this is not something exclusive to Brazil. The vast majority of countries are relying on more than one vaccine for rollout. And I guess just maybe reiterating that point on the environmental agenda. Again, the government is a critical stakeholder, and I think we should all be watching that very closely. The message that comes out of Brasilia, because that gets interpreted by a variety of stakeholders, or we know the fact that, but if you look at deforestation rates, it's very clear that has been interpreted by a range of stakeholders within the Amazon region as sort of a green light to take down part of the forest. I guess that's what the deforestation rates are telling us. But it's not the sole stakeholder in this agenda. I guess there's a lot that companies can do proactively to try to sit down with the government, with NGOs to create. Brazil has a series of very interesting, policies that delivered quite meaningful results. If you look at Moratória da Soja, there's a quite good track record of policies that have been, if not led, at least had a meaningful impact from the private sector, and with very strong and positive results on that front.
Ana Paula, if I could just add a very small comment to that. Thank you. So, first of all, that's a fantastic question. And the only thing that I'll add from the global perspective is that the pandemic has really changed the relationship between the public sector and the private sector, the relationship between government and companies. And that's, again, a pre-existing condition that has been accelerated, but there's been a real break in the level of trust between the public and the government. And, I think that this has put companies in a new and slightly uncomfortable position. And just as you suggested in your question, in situations where governments aren't necessarily acting, there will be an expectation that companies have to act. And we'll sort of have to legislate when countries won't do that. And the public is beginning to expect that more and more. The public expects companies to take a position or to sort of govern themselves when the government won't. And I just think that this is we could talk all day about this. It's fascinating, but I think it's something that companies have to be incredibly sensitive about.
Thank you, Thomaz. Charles, Geert, I don't think you'd like to comment on that. No, I mean, you see your microphone. Okay.
No. I just like to agree with Chuck, and we're actually seeing exactly that happening here in Brazil around vaccinations as well.
That's true. Okay, we have room for one more question. So that question comes from Marcio Zanetti from The Economist. It is about social inequality in Latin America region. Okay, and what he says here is that social inequality has proved to be one of the big weaknesses during the pandemic across the region. How do you see the region escaping from this long-lasting issue? And could the international community play a role in helping the region with real, tangible programs and actions?
That's a very good question. I think this is a global phenomenon, right? Across the globe, if you look at how in almost every country, you see the rich, how they were impacted by COVID, and the poor, how they were impacted. It's just so disproportional, right? This has been a driver of inequality that I think will, in 2-3 years' time, when we have, accurate data about the extent of this, it will be a game changer for, global history. I have no doubt of that. And we have seen this in Brazil in so many ways, right? If you look at even inflation, you can divide that by, income levels, and you see the poor struggling with high inflation rates, which the rich haven't been, right? So this is only likely to accelerate inequality, and Latin America, unfortunately, is just coming out of starting off on a very difficult situation. We're one of the most unequal regions in the region, and it's only going to get worse. So I think it remains to be seen how I guess the international community will react to that. I guess there are some interesting initiatives in many ways. I guess COVAX is an attempt, right, to mitigate some of that inequality on vaccine rollout. It's making some progress. I guess we could all probably argue that this could be better. The idea behind COVAX, that we would be sort of a global moderator of vaccines and would roll out, for example, for the frontline health workers and the elderly people across the globe before moving into, let's say, the adult population of any country. Obviously, we know that this is not how it played out. The rich advanced economies have been able to secure the vaccines independently, are rolling out more successfully than others. So I would be reluctant to see how much the international community can put a halt on that trend, which again, it's probably more exacerbated in Latin America than elsewhere, but it's definitely a global phenomenon.
Okay, Charles, would you like to comment on that in terms of international maybe support or programs that could be used in the, not only, I mean, specifically Latin America, but other regions who face similar situations?
Thank you, Ana Paula. I think in brief, there was a moment at the beginning of the pandemic for increased international cooperation and for governments and international organizations to grasp a number of problems. And I think one of the lessons of the pandemic is that international cooperation in a time of crisis like this did not work very well. And I think that that's probably not a very good indicator of, you know, the future of international cooperation on issues like inequality. There is a chance for change and a chance for evolution. I don't want to put too much hope in the Biden administration. The world is the way it is, regardless of who sits in the White House. But I think we have to make up a lot of lost ground if we're going to see concerted international cooperation on this or any other issue.
Okay, so time just flies. We have reached the end of our webinar. I'm sure we could just be sitting here speaking about so many other topics. And we do apologize that we could not take all the questions due to, well, time constraints. So I'd like to thank once again, thank you very much, Geert, for being with us, Charles, for being with us, Thomaz as well. Very excellent content. We have received plenty of messages congratulating you all to a very interesting presentation. Thank you also on behalf of the British Chamber of Commerce, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you for the audience who joined us for such an interesting discussion. Well, see you all soon at some time at the Chamber or other opportunity. Thank you all very much. Wishing you all a great day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.